Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name's Claire Armitstead. I'm an editor at The Guardian and writer. So I know Romesh very well because we've been old muckers since sort of 2002 or something like that.
Yeah,
when we came out, wasn't it?
Well, that was even longer.
That was longer ago.
You don't want to say it's 25 years, I think, for Reef now.
Very long time ago. I have the pleasure of chairing this session on time past, time present, and we have three quite different writers, but who are all in negotiation with history in one way or another. And to my far right is Shrabani Basu, who you probably all know from Victorian Abdul. Which I was about to call, I kept his name wrong, that wouldn't be very good, was that, would it? Which obviously was picked up and made into a film by Stephen Frears, very successful film, although not as well received as your book critically. Her book was very well received, and there was some cavils about the way that it had translated to the screen. But also, before that, of Spy Princess, which is the life of Noor Inayat Khan, who is having a really extraordinary afterlife at this very moment, is maybe even going to be on a £50 note, but we might come back to that a little bit later.
You're responsible for a lot of things, aren't you, now?
Which has involved Shrabani was discussing with the Sun the ethics of having a World War II spy on the £50 note. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Romesh Gunesekera, who came to actually his first novel, Reef, which was before my time. I have read it, but it's before my time on The Guardian, before the Guardian First Book Prize arrived, when it was the Guardian Fiction Prize.
That's right, when it was the Fiction Prize, yes.
It came up, he's somebody who has blazed this trail, really interesting, distinctive, beautiful writer, not entirely prolific, we were discussing this. He's one of the, he takes his time.
They're very slim books as well.
Most recent is Noontide Toll, which is linked to a series of stories linked by a driver driving around with different passengers in it. And that's another thing that I think we could maybe talk about a bit. I think thing I've noticed, I've just been doing the DSC prize, and I've noticed an awful lot of linked stories are coming up, and I wonder why it is that the linked story novel form is suddenly so popular. And then immediately to my right is Osama Siddique, who is best known as a lawyer and has written you've written various learned legal tomes, haven't you? And has suddenly branched out into fiction with this novel, Snuffing Out the Moon, which is another book of linked stories, but linked stories over an extraordinary time span. So it goes from 2860 BC to 2860 AD. I've got that right, haven't I?
That's right. 2084 to 2084.
2084.
Oh, inspired by 1984. So.
Oh, there you go. I didn't make that up. And then so there are these six periods. One is 455 AD, as I call it, 1620, 1857, and 2009. So I'd just like you to start by saying why such specific dates for this 2,000-year story?
I guess I can't get away from my background as a lawyer. Precision is persuasive, and frankly, when you're dealing with ancient history where you know relatively little about specific aspects of life, it doesn't really matter whether you put down a particular date or not. Who's going to question you? Nobody understands the script from Mohenjo-daro. There's very little we know about the Gandhara civilizations through the few texts that we have. But yeah, I guess it's a problem. It's an obsession as a person who has been a lawyer for precise contours. Having said that, I hope that the stories themselves are a lot more open-ended and have facets to them and not precise in an unrealistic fashion. But there is a bit of research there, because to the extent that I wanted to place the story in Mohenjo-daro in that era, I wanted to be broadly correct in view of available literature as to the kind of climate I'm describing, as to the state of the development of that civilization. But these are obviously dates which are speculative.
I was interested in the 1857, which is 4 years before Prince Albert died, Victoria started doing all these things. These going sort of getting rather more interesting. Why 1857?
So because the story is very much around the so-called Indian Mutiny. And I found it very interesting how historical fiction can have very different kinds of historical characters. There are those which are purely fictitious, there are those which are semi-fictitious, and then there are actual people. So there are actual people like the Emperor Jahangir who's in this story, and there's my take on it. But the 1857 story is primarily about these actual historical figures who were part of a native Bengal infantry, and their arms were taken away when fighting broke out in the rest of India, and they were incarcerated in their barracks, and they broke away from there and they crossed the river and went into what is modern-day Indian Punjab. And that's a story hardly anyone knows about because they were all summarily executed. And so I thought it had a huge amount of resonance because when I was envisioning this book, that well in which their bodies had been thrown had been accidentally rediscovered. And so there is all this typical post-colonial speculation as to whether they were from the north, from the south, Muslim, Hindus, heroes, villains, what should be done with their bodies, cremated, buried, forgotten. And I thought it was really poignant. I did not quite explore the post-colonial thing, but I thought that was a very important moment in sort of modern South Asian history. And since that episode is integral to my story, so I could actually pinpoint the year, because all those events took place within a span of 3 months during 1857.
And then 2009 again.
2009 is a very important, if you look at it, that particular book is called the Book of the Vakil, or the Lawyer. So in many ways, I think modernity is defined by formal legal systems. If you look at the entire colonial legal project, it is ultimately the colonization project, it is ultimately a legal project because everything is, it's sort of reduced to very precise legal terms, and the Penal Code and the Contract Act. And if you look at the post-colonial, we are living in the world of constitutions and civil liberties. And lawyers in Pakistan are particularly interesting sociologically because they're also incredibly political. So 2009 is the point where you see the lawyers' movement. And in many ways, it's formalism versus what is actually happening in society, the dream of a constitutional state, and what actually happens to ordinary people living within that system. So that was a year in which I was quite active in these protests. And I thought that is a year which sort of pretty much signified that entire mood of the post-colonial state.
Mm-hmm. So what you've given us is a book which has very, very particular histories in it. But then you give us this future, tomorrow, the future section is called Tomorrow, in which you say the countless fabrications fed to people over millennia in the name of a discipline that used to be called history. So they don't have history, they have wiped out their sense of history.
So yeah, I mean, it's a kind of dystopia, unfortunately, because the way things are going, it's hard to be overtly optimistic, although the title is optimistic. But there are two things happening here. One is really what one sees as the spread of hate speech and the facility with which hate speech can be spread through technology. The other, which is a big crisis, is water, and how the nation state may or may not survive 60, 70 years from now, whether we'll have huge conglomerates which will be controlling this part of the world, is something I speculate about. But I think integral to all that is that whenever we define the future or the present, we have a certain notion of history. Is the history which we have come to believe now, will it even survive the test of time, or will the ascendant power write a new history? What could that new history look like? So I think those are the kind of themes which speculated me. And I guess the link with the earlier ages is that what really changes? Is it the same story in the human civilizational project repeating itself again and again? Or do we actually evolve in these 4,000 years? And if so, in what way?
Well, I'm going to park you there. Let's raise lots of issues that we can pick up. I'm going to come now to Shrabani, because there's a lot of words to digest there. And Shrabani has a little slideshow to go with the thing about Victoria and Albert.
Well, actually,
Victoria and Abdul.
It's VOA, but with a twist. Very naughty there. But what Osama just said, that was really interesting. But who's going to write this history? So when I set out writing this book, I'd grown up in India, and the image of Victoria is this very dour woman, very not a bone of, nothing, no humor, and very sort of well, dressed in black, representing empire. And what I'd read a little bit about Abdul, he was presented as a rogue, you know, sort of somebody who manipulated her. And I said, well, I'm going to have fun here. But as I started off and I researched them, they're just different, you know, the whole story was different because of who had written it.
Of course.
It was written, Abdul's story was written from the other side. But for those who don't know, I mean, Abdul was a clerk in Agra jail, and he came for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. He was literally a present wrapped up and sent. And he came with this other, sorry, I have to point it this way, don't I? So he came with this other man who was Muhammad Baksh, who was actually a servant, but Abdul was a clerk, so he was educated. But the whole idea then was to put empire on display, so they were really decorative objects to start with. Dressed up, only job to stand behind her at table, look grand, blot her signature. But very quickly, it was Abdul who got the Queen's eye, almost from the word go. And she wanted to have special lessons with him. She wanted to learn Urdu. She wanted to, well, he made her a curry. And of course, she was conquered. So it was yeah, there's nothing like a bit of spice. So he, so very quickly, within a few, within a year, he was just 24 when he came, she was 68. Within a year, he was promoted to becoming her munshi. The other guy just stood there, Muhammad Baksh, poor guy. He kept doing the same old duties. Well, Abdul had double lessons, so he could pick up his English. He was bright. He picked up really quickly. And then he was promoted to becoming her munshi, which is why he was then painted in these gorgeous clothes. And this is the portrait that actually set me off on this journey, because it's in Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. And when I saw this picture, I said, he's no servant. He's been painted like a Nawab, like a nobleman. And then I saw more pictures, and yeah, that was the start of it. I was just very curious. And in her bedroom, there was in Osborne House, there were two pictures. One was of John Brown, who was her gilly, and she'd had a relationship with him after Albert's death. And below John Brown was our man, Abdul Karim. So I was very, very curious. I said,
that's interesting, because his looks grand, but his eyes look humble, don't they?
He's painted with a book in his hand. It's not how and he's, you know, this whole sideways glance. And, well, it was quite interesting to see how she, you know, the artist was told to make him grand, clearly, and there he was. So let's have a look at some other ones. So Queen Victoria, to keep this short because it's such a long story over 13 years, but she learned, the other thing I learned was that Queen Victoria learned Urdu every day, something I didn't know. And I thought initially she would learn a few phrases of Urdu. But what happened is when I went to Windsor Archives to research, the archivist brought in a trolley with 13 volumes. She used to learn every day. And you can see in this picture, she signed her name in Urdu and in English. And this is later on in her years. And this, we should get another picture here. Sorry, am I not pointing it? This is her last entry in Urdu. She has written half a page. So this was quite a revelation. It was a new Victoria that I discovered. It was also a different Abdul, because then subsequently I found his diaries in Karachi, and I could put the whole story together. So yeah, it was, I guess, history being written from below. Well, here's Victoria with her other servants, because by that time she wanted more Indian servants, and you know, the Queen asked, she gets. So they all came from Agra, and they all were Muslims from Agra. They all had to have halal meat. It's really interesting. So I think Queen Victoria is probably the first British monarch to have had halal chicken. It was her favorite. Oh, sorry, this is my other book. So. Victoria suddenly sorry, I'll go back to Victoria, shall I? Yeah.
So I mean, it was, in a way, it was quite a sad story, wasn't it? Because everybody got very jealous of him. Nobody, her family didn't like the way that he was her favourite.
Oh, absolutely. Not just the family, the household. They all hated him. The one thing they had in common was that they all hated Abdul Karim. He was causing such chaos in the court. One of her doctors, he describes it as munshi mania. That is a line picked up in the film, you know, and he actually says it. So a lot of my source material is the doctor's diary. And And they go on strike. They say, we're going to resign. This is suddenly the union of the household. They want to resign if she goes out with him to the south of France, which she used to do every year. And they send one of the ladies to say, tell the queen that if she doesn't drop Abdul, we're going to all resign collectively. And Queen Victoria just flies into a temper and throws everything down from her table, ink pots, pens, everything crashing down. Poor Mrs. Phipps goes running from the room. And of course, nobody resigns. They all tamely go to the south of France. And the score is always the same. It's Victoria and Abdul's 1, household nil, because they keep trying.
So is that written up in whose diary?
It's Reed's diary. Thank goodness for diaries. What would historians like me do without a vivid description of Mrs. Phipps running? So I could just, I had like a wealth of material to really bring this scene to life. And some of you who've seen the film have seen it. And nobody like Judi Dench to then execute it. It was fabulous.
Because I was sure that was a bit of fiction that
No, it's absolutely true. If you read the book, it's all footnoted.
Oh, really?
And then they didn't stop with that. They kept on plotting. And the next stage was to say that we are going to ask you to step down on grounds of insanity. And this is something that no biographer of Queen Victoria found. It's 3 lines mentioned in Reed's journals. And I saw this, and I said, this is incredible. This is the Queen at 80. This is Queen Victoria, represents empire and industrial revolution. You don't ask her to step down at 80. And Bertie and her son, they'd all plotted to do this. And of course, Queen Victoria, you can't bully her. She just sends them, when they go to her and say, we want you to step down, she goes to them, she sends them a 32-page memo and calls them out for being racist, for class snobbery. And she says, Abdul will have everything that he gets, and I might even give him a knighthood. All this is there. Wow. She steps back on the knighthood because the Prime Minister and the Viceroy say, you can't give him a knighthood, because you give knighthoods to the Indian Maharajas and the Indian princes. And Indians are equally snobs. Class functions as much as it does there as in British society. So they said they'd be offended if this commoner from Agra was Sir Abdul. So she steps back. She recognizes that.
One of the interesting things of that story is when you think about the lasting impact of it, one of them is our eating habits. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that's a good moment to go with. The cross-cultural, quite apart from in terms of actual sort of rule and war and subjugation, there is also this incredible cross-fertilization culturally. And you particularly have cricket in one of your novels.
And food as well.
And food.
Started out with food, moved on to cricket. But
I'm just interested in the two of you in what this means to you. The idea, because often we have this thing about history being written by the victor. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, and there's there's loads of things that both of you have said which kind of resonate and which you can explore hugely. But in terms of, who writes the history and so on, quite apart from the food and the cricket, actually, there's a line in here, for example. This book begins with a man talking pretty much about that, where he talks about how, he says he's at a checkpoint and he says, in 1945, Japan was a dump. Nobody thought the Japanese could make even a cup of tea anymore. But now, Toyota is the biggest car company in the world. It's a funny business, I tell them. No one knows who'll have the last laugh. Look at Germany, same thing. German tourists are rolling in it now. Their chancellor is the boss of Europe. Makes you wonder about the business of defeat and victory. And that book, again, is about trying to work out, after something traumatic happens, particularly historically. This was 2009, we were talking about, the end of the war in Sri Lanka. And almost immediately it seemed to me that the narrative of history was going to change, and there was going to be competing histories. And when I traveled around immediately after the war, there was this strange, dual, almost schizoid thing. On the one hand, there was an idea that maybe it never happened, the war never happened, and things were being erased. Battle areas were being erased, cemeteries were being concreted over. There was an effort as though we would pretend nothing happened. At the same time, there was an equal desire for the victors to proclaim victory.
Yes.
But somehow, so it was almost like it was a victory over something that didn't exist. And it struck me that all the time these things are changing. And I wanted to kind of explore that in fiction, because in a sense, fiction partly explores how these different things work. And what I found really interesting was, in writing this particular book, which is set immediately after the end of the war, and it's about a van driver going around and seeing what happened, looking at evidence, if you like, was that not only was evidence, if you like, changing, the world changing, but the way we handle it, which is through language, or the way I handle it through language is also changing. And it's changing incredibly fast. So the tool that you're using is also changing. And with this book, Noontide Toll, even the title, I use it for that purpose. The word toll has a special resonance when you think in terms of a long war or the tsunamis, also, all these tragic things. But for my van driver who tells the story, it's a word that's going to change. In that moment, when I just read out those lines, toll would still be the toll of a war or whatever. But a little later on, a year later, he's driving down a road, a new road, which somebody was telling me about in Sri Lanka now. There's a new expressway going to the south, which is a motorway. And what does it have? It has a toll plaza, yes, where you have to pay to go in it. So Vasanta, the van driver, is going to go up and down this over the years. So by now, for example, 2018, toll would have a different meaning, different resonance completely. So the idea of trying to capture that difference of language as well as the reality, it seemed to me is something that is worth doing and which I try to do. And to come back to your thing about cricket, and again, what we're talking about, I suppose, I wrote a book called The Match, which has cricket as a metaphor running through it, but it also has the happier story of, if you like, of Sri Lanka, which is Sri Lankan cricket, up to a point at the time when I was writing it anyway. It was the better story. So it was about the Sri Lankan cricket partly, and a character who gets obsessed by cricket. And
I mean, there is a history of serious historians like C.L.R. James,
yes,
telling the story of nationhood through sport.
Yes, and I was interested in trying to work out how identity works and why people support different teams, whether it's in football or cricket. And it's interesting, as time goes on, these loyalties to these groups become extraordinary, Manchester United is supported by people from all over the world who have no connection with Manchester. And even the Sri Lankan cricket team has huge support among people who are not Sri Lankan. And that sort of interested me. Why? And of course with cricket, again, like cricket, of course, it's not only the team you support, but the fact that you sometimes support people who are doing really, really badly. It's kind of masochistic desire to see this, well, in C.L.R. James, Greek tragedy being performed for you over and over again. So I was kind of interested in all of that. But I was also interested in, again, fiction and reality. And so in that book, I do... quite a central part of the scene in that book is a real cricket match between Sri Lanka and India at the Oval down here. And it involves really a very special moment that isn't cricketing at all, but it's to do with a pigeon on the field. And a photograph that my character takes. And it was really, really interesting. Eventually, when the book came out, it was reviewed in the TLS. The TLS gave it a big spread. But what was really interesting was, in the review, they got a photograph, which was the photograph my fictional character had taken, but they managed to find one that somebody had taken of exactly the scene I had described. So it was really that blend of the reality and imagination that I just enjoy.
And I want to come back to language and to the way that it changes. And this is something that you obviously have had to deal with a lot.
Yes.
So you're dealing with several periods with their own historical words, vocabularies, syntaxes, ways of thinking.
So I guess one of the challenges of writing a book like this was how do I make a distinction between these eras, because I have relatively short space to try and create these characters. There has to be something distinctive. And so I guess there's a lot of invention which goes into the really ancient history, because I guess it's more cliched, but I imagined a more pastoral, idyllic kind of a language for the ancient sort of civilization. Gandhara somewhat was more convenient in the sense that a lot of my characters in the Gandhara period are monks, Buddhist monks. And the entire story revolves around the last days of Taxila, which is the grand university, Buddhist university, monastery. And so since the conversations are theological, so at least I can borrow from Buddhist texts, the language of the monk, I would assume, as long as I don't make a mistake of introducing a theological idea which had not arrived in Buddhism by then. Mughal is more grand, Persianized Urdu, I would imagine. So whatever can be an equivalent. Colonial, one new. Contemporary, yes. The future had to be invented. So it's a bit more cryptic. Certain ideas, of course, have changed. It's the post-nation state existence as it is imagined. So yeah, so there's a fair amount of experimentation there. Now, the big challenge is that when people are jumping from one era to the other, how disconcerting it becomes, or whether it flows or not. And that's for the reader to decide. But I wanted them to be able to compartmentalize these while connecting them, but also compartmentalize these periods also through the flavor of language. And I guess the fact that I myself read and write also in Urdu and understand Punjabi, so there are these two other literary traditions, does have an impact on how I even write sort of English. That idiom, of course, gets affected consciously or subconsciously. There are a couple of interesting failed poets who are also in this book. So those were quite interesting because they are obviously really keen to have an audience and are also not very talented. So, I guess you create opportunities to develop characters you want to have fun with and can play around with language.
Now, it's set, the two districts that you've picked on are Sindh and Punjab. Is that right?
So, the 1847 sort of action takes place. So the geography of this book is really interesting because when we were looking for a map, and I'll come to the district point, how do you make a map of a region which has boundaries now, but did not have these boundaries, or will not probably have these boundaries in the rest of the 5 eras? So I almost envisioned it as a satellite map, a satellite picture of a chunk of land. And so that chunk of land is really Pakistan stretching from Peshawar all the way to Mohenjo-daro, and then going eastwards into India, into Lucknow and Patna and a few other places. But the action in 1857 is really on the boundary. It's Lahore and it's Amritsar and the area in between, which is also symbolic in a way because that's the period which is really leading up to the national boundary. So it's almost interesting that the action is also at that point, in that particular period. But the point you make about identity, it also sort of occurs to me, much as I agree with what you say, that though some identities are becoming more globalized and more international, I also see the reverse happening, which was the impetus here, because for a lot of Pakistanis, this notion of their own self-identity is increasingly, unfortunately, very limiting. So history starts in the year 712 AD when Islam came and all that. So I think at a political level, subconsciously, I was quite keen to own all the history before that and how it enriches our life and how you can't ignore it because in many ways it defines how we think, how we behave, how our political structures are actually structured, what our language is like. So identity can also be an incredibly limiting thing, which is something which at least I want to push back against.
But the writing is interesting, the fact that you want to own it, because to some extent the writing of stories is about owning a certain reality and actually saying it is yours because you've written about it, or indeed because you've read about it.
Yes.
And it's a story, a series of stories about the establishment and the outsider, isn't it?
Yes.
Right away from the very beginning to the very end. At the end, they're called the regressives.
Yes.
At the very beginning, there's the boy who isn't in the city.
Yes. So I think it's very much, I think Pakistan has a fairly glorious tradition of dissent. You have amazing poetry from people like Faiz on dissent. And I've always been fascinated by the idea of dissenters and the cost that they have to pay, which is mostly exile. It may be intellectual, it may be physical. So in many ways, the protagonists in all these stories, which is also the commonality I wanted to strike, is that there is almost always a status quo. There's almost always a degeneration of society in one way or the other. And there are people who speak out and they pay the price. So in Mohenjo-daro, you have someone who's looking at the emergence of priests. In the Buddhist era, you have these monks who are looking at whether Buddhism is really practiced according to its spirit anymore, or it has become insular. In the Mughal period, you have these small-time tricksters who are talking about privilege and the privilege of the Mughals. You have fairly recognizable dissenters, of course, in 1857, the entire war. You have all these people who are being crushed by the system and are either outlaws or users of the legal system. And then in the future, it turns out that this notion of apartheid continues. You have people who are spiritual, but that's not acceptable anymore. It's a pragmatic, rationalist society. So they are called the regressives. They are the outcasts. And you wonder what has really changed in 4,000 years. So yeah, the dissent, being an outcast, and the title, Snuffing Out the Moon, also comes from a line by Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who's written a lot of poetry in prison, and there's this one particularly beautiful poem in which he describes that the despot may do this and may do that and may curb dissent in all kinds of ways, but he cannot snuff out the moon. So hope remains, So in that sense, so I guess it's very funny how people read your book. I was recently approached by some students who wanted me to do a TED talk. And it was a line which was about hope. Roshan kahin bahar ke imkan hue to hain, And I said, where did you find hope in my book? How did you discover it? It's amazing how open. So they said your title. And the fact that you are obviously celebrating dissent and dissenters. And the fact is that the struggle goes on.
It's the shadow story, it's the story. Yeah. So now we come to another shadow story. I want to come onto the Spy Princess, because this is a really extraordinary story. And it's also interesting that you say history is also, we say, is written by the victors. It's also written by men, usually. And so you pick two stories which feature women.
True. Well, the second book we're talking about is Spy Princess. It's the life of Noor Inayat Khan. It's a biography. And Noor Inayat Khan was a secret agent in the Second World War. She was born in Moscow. Her father was Indian, and her mother was American. She was born in Moscow, came to London, then they grew up, they went back to France, and she grew up in Paris. And when the war broke out, the family moved here as refugees, as it happens. So she came with her brother, mother, and sister, and immediately volunteered for the war effort. She wanted to do her bit in the war, and she previously, in her last life, she was a musician, and she's a Sufi. She believes in non-violence. So there's a lot happening there, but she's determined to fight fascism. She wants to do her bit. She signs up for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And from there, because she's fluent in French, there is this very secret organization called the Special Operations Executive, started directly by Churchill, and she's recruited for this. And she is then infiltrated into occupied France, the first woman radio operator to be sent in to one of the most dangerous areas in the field, where the life expectancy was actually 6 weeks. But Noor Inayat Khan went in there, and she survived 3 months. Wow. Well, this is her. I should show you a beautiful picture, which you've already seen. So that's her. And she survived 3 months, but it's a tragic story because she is very beautiful. There is this love triangle that happens, and she is betrayed by the sister of one of the other agents she's working with. And her address is sold to the Gestapo, and they arrest her. And then she is kept in well, she makes attempts to break up, to escape from the prisons. So she's classified as highly dangerous. This gentle writer and of children's stories and dreamer suddenly becomes Madeleine, the most dangerous agent in the field. This transformation happens there. Let's have a look at it. Well, this is her when she's in Paris. You can see her. She's a musician. Her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, used to play the veena, and she learnt the veena. But all this, and she used to play the harp. Of course, all this is left behind in 1940 when she comes to England and volunteers. And this is her in her Air Force uniform, WAF uniform. Well, she's betrayed. She's captured. She is then sent off to Forza prison after her escape attempt. She's too hot to handle, so Paris says, we have to get rid of her. So she is sent to Germany. Again, the first woman agent to be sent into a German prison, where she's kept shackled in a solitary cell. She's shackled from her wrists, she's shackled, her feet are shackled, chain connecting these, she's tortured. She doesn't give away anything. And finally, she's sent to Dachau concentration camp, where she's executed. Let me see if there's another picture. Okay, I'll go back to this later. She's executed, but she goes down screaming, "Liberté!" So they can't break her spirit. She's awarded the George Cross, and France gives her the Croix de Guerre. So the highest civilian awards are given to her, but her story was completely forgotten. There was one story on her one book on her written by her friend, and that came out in the 1950s. And since then, her story was forgotten, and I came into this, again, it was a picture of hers, this picture, which was a tiny, in the Times or Telegraph, there was a little article about Indians in the war, in the Second World War, and all they had was a little photograph of hers with a caption. And I was so intrigued because I said, who is this woman in the heart of Europe? How did she get there? And that started my journey with her, which then went beyond the book, as it happens, because once the book came out, people said, thank you for writing her story, and there should be a memorial for her. And so I was carrying this burden. I said, okay, I've got to do something. So I actually set up a trust, the Noor Inayat Khan Memorial Trust. I got my friends on board, we lobbied, and we had her memorial, which is here in Gordon Square, not far from here. So, do go down and see it, visited by people from all over the world. And it's it's become part of the Bloomsbury Peace Walk, which is really nice. People come, there's flowers, the Jewish people come and put stones. So it's really, and Remembrance Day, of course, happens. And we remember 13th September, the day she was executed. And we do our urs for her, because Sufis have an urs. So 13th September, look out, do come there. There'll always be somebody, little group.
It's so interesting, isn't it? It touches on the whole business of whose stories survive and why do they survive. This is survived because of you, basically, her story has, because you happened to see something in a newspaper and then brought her story out.
Yes, in a way. And then I think it was the readers who were also inspiring me, because they were inspired, and then they asked for the memorial. It wasn't my idea. I'd have written the book and gone away, but then I felt I had to carry this through. And now there's this, some of you may have read it in the papers, somebody else has put a petition. So her story has really gone around, and they want her face on the £50 note. So they rang me and they said, will you support us? And I said, of course I will. And yesterday, the Sun newspaper said, we support Noor Inayat Khan on the £50 note. And I said, this world has gone crazy. So, but it's good crazy.
There's something about timing as well. There's the right time for certain things to happen. Yeah. Because I remember coming across back in the 90s, and I think it was Art Malik actually wanted to make a film. Okay. So when we had a discussion, he wanted me to write a piece about it, and I just couldn't. I wasn't able to do that thing. But the name was there, but nothing happened as a result, even though a few people were interested. And then I think somebody wrote another thing. She's been a little figure in complex stories, and now her time is coming thanks to you.
Well, 2003 was the big thing, because that's when they declassified the files. And that was around the time I said, I must get serious, I have to write. It had been playing on me, and I wanted to write it. I didn't have the confidence then. I'm a journalist. Can I do a biography? I'd never really attempted this. But as soon as her files, it all happened at the same time. 2003, National Archives, you had her files, And there I said, I've got to do it. This is a sign. And in these files, which is obviously a major source for the book, her telegrams from the field, the letters, the reason she joins, which is so touching, because she writes that all other, I know there's family considerations, but I realize how important this war is. And so all other considerations are not as important. And that's the letter that she accepts. And her interview was just about 1 minute, and she was told, you'll be sent, it was all in French, and she didn't know why he's speaking to her in French in the middle of London. And he says, you'll be sent into the field, you won't have a uniform, so no protection. If you're caught, you'll be shot, and will you take the job? And she says, yes. And it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, because she meant it. She did want to do it. So
just before we finish, because we're coming to the end, I just wanted, this is a micro story, but then there's also the macro stories, and you mentioned water. And your novel, Reef, your first novel, that first novel, it has become a sort of teaching text now, hasn't it? Because you were dealing with the break, it's sort of about the way that the destruction of the reef, big great reef around Sri Lanka, which...
As it turned out, was what happened when the tsunami came. The fact that the reef had been eroded by exploitation was a factor in thousands of people dying, really. But yes, the time has come. But it's interesting how it takes a long time for these things to emerge, to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is, so I mean, that's really is the big story of our history now, isn't it? Is the displacement of people and water.
Absolutely, yeah.
The othering, yeah.
It's definitely the big issue now.
And you wonder whether sort of the more conventional lenses for looking at how things are carrying on, you know, the more conventional economic frameworks and the political frameworks will become quite ancillary to these larger global concerns, so that we'll really feel the need to reinvent a lot of the forms with which we govern things, right? So I think a lot of dismantling is taking place. Some of it consciously and some of it not so consciously.
Well, you posit the idea of a catastrophe which is based on religious, political breakdown pretty much around now.
Yeah, so I think what's fascinating in the South Asian context, and we can see it elsewhere, is this reinvention of the past, the glorious past, may it be the Islamic or the Hindutva past, or making America great again. You know, so all these new narratives which are emerging are also incredibly divisive narratives. And you multiply that many times with the ability to divide people. Twitter is not about love, as we know. Twitter is about angst and ridicule and things like that. And a lot of social media is, unfortunately. And I think hate is now manifesting itself so much more potently and multifariously. That's bound to have an impact also on how things unfortunately play out, unless we address this. And I don't mean censorship, but I mean that whatever is the opposite of this also has to organize itself, which doesn't seem to be the case right now.
I think we have to end there, but I have to say this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and there are loads of really good books for people to go and seek out if you haven't sought them out already. Do we have any signings going on afterwards, or is it?
I think they have books there.
We have books, do we? I hope. Anyway,
Books are outside,
they are outside. Okay, well, you can continue. Please do continue.
Osama's books there in a special stand, so if you can get it.
Please do continue the conversation and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you for coming along, and thank you for
Thank you so much.
Thank you.